Welcome to the Salish Harvest Wild Ideas podcast. This place is a gathering for conversations from across the Salish Sea bioregion on wild food, wild medicine, and wild ways of being. I hope you enjoy our conversation for today. Oh, welcome. So happy to have you as the first guest on the Salish Harvest podcast. And yeah, just to dive into the history of this project as one of the founding humans that started it from the ground up, I would love to learn more about your personal journey and what led you to establishing Access to Media Education Society, and just like who you are and why you do this work, why you love it, what has brought you here.
I realize that none of the answers is going to necessarily be straightforward. So the practical part of how I got to be involved with AMES is, I moved over to Galiano. I was taking what was meant to be a 1-semester sabbatical from university, where I had been so busy feeding my head that I was kind of neglecting my body, and my body started screaming at me. And I thought it was good to take a little break from university. I was doing my master's in communications at SFU at the time. And so I'd heard about this little island that someone I'd met at an art opening lived at. So I decided I'd take a semester off and come here. And I'd never set foot on a Gulf Islands before, and then got here, and this place healed lots of things I didn't even realize were broken. And that 1 semester away ended up, well, we're now 30 years and counting. And where I serendipitously ended up living was right beside the person who ended up starting the Gulf Islands Film and Television School. And I was very involved in helping start that. So AMES was born out of GIFTS. GIFTS was a private business. And I started working with the whole staff crew. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was a 1-week format intensive, like a filmmaking boot camp, 6 days. It was housed in a recycled logging camp. And I was sort of responsible in the early days for getting lots of students there. And I was working for sweat equity. I was working for them to pay my rent. And I felt like if I was going to do that kind of sweat equity, I wanted to make sure I was doing sweat equity for people who normally don't have access to the tools of media production. So my whole thing was, I'd like to start doing this kind of short format programming. And I saw the transformative potential of it. And so that is sort of the beginning of how AMES developed. We started doing, in the very first year of programming, we did a week for Indigenous youth, a week of programming for youth who were street involved, racialized youth, queer youth, and HIV positive youth. So all of the core members that were more interested in film, but also had a critical analysis around issues of representation. A lot of that core group who happened to be on the island, we sort of picked themes based on the communities we all hailed from. And so really the mandate at that point was trying to put the tools of cultural production in the hands of communities that were either misrepresented or invisibilized in the mainstream media, and really using this 6-day program in a more intentional way to both decolonize stories that had been told, clear space, tell stories of healing, and be in community for a lot of folks who are often marginalized in their various social contexts to be centered. So that's what really the early days of AMES was really about, trying to have people be able to reclaim their stories. And I think the thing that drew me to video production, I'd had many years of education that I was very practiced in the art of critical dissection, which is, I think, part of what hurt my spirit and made me ill. The idea that my brain was trained to cut things up into little pieces. My brain was not being trained to build. I think part of why I'm attracted to storytelling for change is that in story and in art, you can reach the hard to reach spaces that sometimes the intellect can't go. The idea of being able to blend the art of critical deconstruction with creativity, so that it wasn't just critique, that there was something that actually was nourishing. And I felt like that was the more holistic approach
Mm.
and a more sustainable practice that I could get behind. The mandate has been pretty much from the get-go storytelling for personal and systemic or social transformation. Think about even the origins of my own transformation, that how I needed to focus on work that had a good, fierce advocacy edge, but that also had that something else that
Mm.
creativity and story bring that is more restorative and healing.
Beautiful. Yes. So inspiring. And I'm curious to lean into that more, like that dance between the digital and the tangible, the storytelling through a medium like film, and then what happens in person when, like you said, you slowed down and you came in contact with a landscape that was really nourishing you in ways that you hadn't felt before. And I don't necessarily have a clear question around that, but I'm curious of that dynamic tension between the digital and the tangible, and what your experience has been in finding a way to bridge that through media and story sharing, but doing it in person with small groups or directed to community, directed to create tangible change in the world. Yeah, I'm curious if you just want to riff on that for a moment and share
Mhm.
what you've discovered in those areas.
Going way back, I think about, for me as someone who's biracial, I think that, I feel at a cellular level, destined to, drawn to, trying to integrate polarities or binaries. And so, that idea for me, pure activism couldn't feed me fully. Neither could pure academia, neither could pure artistry. So that idea of trying to integrate as opposed to picking one of the camps. And also in terms of coming here, even though I was very lucky to spend a lot of summers in the place where I had access to the trees and water growing up. So that was kind of in my DNA. But for a long time, from the age of 18 to 26, when I moved to Galiano, was in urban landscapes and really feeding my head, really intellectual. Like, people laughed when I moved to the Gulf Islands because I was not Gulf Islands material. I regained access to parts of myself that had been sidelined. And that said, I led a pretty crazy life over here, trying to start a film school and an organization. So the irony is that it filled me up, but then I used all that energy in a way that, I spend a lot of time on a computer, despite the fact that I live in the woods. I mean, now I'm more intentional about deeply accessing, the ocean, being embodied in it on a regular basis. And I do think it propels, grounds, and sustains all of the work that I personally do. It's been important for me as someone who's kind of urbane, critical, activist ties, but to be here and to do what I can to create safe passage for people. Because the fact of the matter is, class dynamics being what they are, it is harder for people to access places like this. For all I tell the story about the romance of how I was healed, it means that I am another occupier here on these lands. It means that I come here and I get healed, and in the process, part of an energy of displacing others, part of a whole gentrification of the islands, even though I'd like not to be, but that is the fact of the matter. And I think it's interesting to talk about different forms of displacement. So, there's displacement from land, which is, of course, many, many Indigenous communities have experienced. And then there's also a displacement from the center of cultural teachings on the land. And so the genesis of this project was, we met with some of the folks that were working with the Penelakut Health Center, and they wanted to do something that really kind of brought people back into traditional food practices. And there was an acknowledgement that a lot of the young people, because of the impacts of colonization, because of the impacts of racism, where, so much pressure to assimilate, so much pressure to move into the cash economy, so much pressure to put a distance between yourself and food practices, medicinal practices that were more land-based. And because a lot of the land itself had been deeply damaged because of the impacts of colonization. So there was a desire to do restoration, cultural revitalization work within Penelakut, but also an acknowledgement that there wasn't a lot of interest among the young people. There was a lot of significant knowledge holders here. And so the idea was, let's get the elders together talking about what they know, to share knowledge. And how do we engage young people to be interested in being part of the conversation? And so really, to be honest, technology played two roles. Learning film skills was the carrot to entice people to be involved. So use that carrot to have people documenting these events, which was great to document them anyway. But really, the ultimate reason was to be listening to what was being shared, to begin to be part of many, many things that were going on, to try to bring some of these old seeds to young people who could plant them in new soil.
Feeling currents of a new dream, I know you see it, my love. Vision from above, felt within our trust. That being here in this moment, without a doubt, we know it's time to thrive. Yes, we come alive, peaceful warriors alive.
So we did a range of things. There was young people who were involved in the circles with the elders, and then we would do projects with young people where we would use different technology to like make a short documentary using iMovie. So a lot of it was experimenting with all sorts of little things to build relations, seed curiosity, make the knowledge that was being gained visible so that that had a wider community. There was an elder who has since passed, Karen Charlie, who was absolutely central to all of this. And she was so good at doing these medicine walks with the kids. So a lot of it was they'd have their iPads and do medicine walks. I would say, these are the plants we want to cover because we want to get footage for that for Salish Harvest. And she'd be like, yeah. And she'd go into a class and she would say, what are some of the health concerns you're dealing with in your family? She started from relevance, and then she immediately pivoted to a walk that spoke directly. She would make the medicine walk customized to what was alive and relevant for them, and just had the knowledge to be able to do that. It was so inspiring. The video product is the anchor, but it's not the goal. But of course, it is good to celebrate the anchor and have a place for it to be represented so that it can be celebrated in community, so that it can be referenced as people step back into a more robust knowledge of plants and medicines in their midst that can be leaned upon as issues of food security. And in this moment that we're in of extreme inflation, or in the pandemic when accessing, well, there's no grocery store, for instance, on Penelakut. Salish Harvest was really just a storehouse to celebrate the restoration of connections between Penelakut and Galiano, celebrate the work that the young people were doing, celebrate the knowledge the elders were having, and try to just, again, be part of building momentum, thirst, interest. And I would say that I can even notice quite a difference between 2012 when we started and now in terms of young people's appetite for place-based story, plant-based learning. I mean, the times have changed, but I also think the appetite has changed. So. This getting out from decades of colonization is messy, long-term business. I think that any opportunity for people to enact cultural pride, to awaken curiosity, awaken buried ancestral knowledge is, I think, in the bigger picture, that famous quote from Louis Riel about, our people will be asleep for 100 years and it'll be the artists that bring their spirits back. I feel like there is a spirit resurgence that's happening. There's still so much healing work to be done. So I want to touch the big vision, which is Indigenous-led land-based revolution, really. That's what I'd love to see, where Indigenous communities are at the helm of land stewardship and land back. That's the grand vision. But I think you've probably got a couple of generations where there's a lot of small acts that lead to the bigger act. So my small picture vision is for people to be reminded that their voices matter, their knowledge matters, because I think that there's also a lot of Indigenous, non-Indigenous collaboration, but I'd like to see it be Indigenous-led as opposed to, I'm an immigrant settler. And even though I think the real leader of this initiative for the last decade has been Karen Charlie, I've been doing a lot of the behind the scenes. So I'd love to see more and more of it be passed on, say, to her granddaughter. I think that there needs to be time and space to grieve what's been lost, to acknowledge that reconnecting with that ancestral knowledge will take time. And cultural disenfranchisement is part of the legacy of an Indigenous identity in colonial times. And to keep reckoning with that work. What I like about what you do with the podcast, like little features on, how to harvest usnia, what its medicinal purposes are, what salau was used for in the past, what cedar was used for in the past, what it can be used for now. All of that is important because that's a digestible little piece. But that little piece has to be seen in the greater framework of what's being healed, what is being restored, what's the backdrop of that moment of stepping back into profound, deep land-based cultural knowledge. I was given a Hul'quim'in'um name, Squatty Slaney, and it means basically crazy lady. And it was because I would come there, and I just had this like really project management ethos, my little clipboard, and I had these things I wanted to achieve. And they knew I had a good heart, but they also were just like, not my scene. Also, I remember I have like such a visceral sense of my early days of going to Penelakut. I came with a shroud of settler-based guilt and anxiety that I brought this fear of doing things wrong, knowing everything was wrong. I brought this like energy, this vibrating energy that was really mired in guilt and grief. And again, that's part of the preparatory work for, I don't love the word reconciliation because I think so much of it is like pressure is on Indigenous folks to forgive. But I think about that preparatory work for kind of a genuine reconciliation where a lot of that is just about relationship building. And a lot is about what happens when people who have well-grounded history of mistrust and people with a well-informed history of shame about settler conquest and privilege that, oh yes, I quote unquote own property on this land that is your territory. Like, how do we come together knowing that so much of what came before us was wrong? And I would try to sometimes force those conversations. And I mean, Karen would often make fun of me and just go like, okay, you're overdoing it now. Like, it's like, you're just you. You have to go through it. Like, I think that if you're going to really do it genuinely, you have to be really honest. And I think that that takes time and space. And I think that it's those stories of apprehension, of mistrust, of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, when we do collaborations and then we suddenly are confronted with all these colonized notions about what a project looks like and focusing on outcomes and figuring our way through together. And there's mutual healing in it.
There's something in that I hear of really staying with the process and staying with the trouble, so to speak. A phrase a beautiful man, Bioregion, shares of staying with the trouble, staying with the challenge of working with this unlearning process and this rebuilding of relationship and leaning in with curiosity and with humility of the inevitability of making mistakes in that process, but to stay with it. I love that there's like playfulness embedded in that. And
yeah, and they totally love it, like squatchy slitty, because sort of like, oh, a settler will be so excited that she got an indigenous name, and it doesn't mean like connection to the land or anything like that, no. And apparently, and I forgot this, she said the first time we did it, like I cried because I was like, you really don't like me, and they were like, oh God, yeah. And then just to add insult, and again, it was the playfulness to see like, what can she take a little bit? I would introduce myself as Squatty Salini in gatherings. And then like about a year and a half later, they said, oh yeah, actually it means good in bed. I said, I've been introducing myself to the community, and I still to this day don't know that's true or not. So I don't know. I don't know.
Currents of a new dream, I know you see it, my love. Vision from above, felt within our trust.
I'm curious to zoom out a bit again, because I know you have so many beautiful things that you're supporting and nourishing and cultivating under the umbrella of AMES. And I'm curious to touch on some of those because you're doing really amazing work still with youth focused around cultural sensitivity. And I'd love to just hear about the different projects that you have going on.
Crossroads is really a step towards building a community where we can talk to each other and share our different feelings, which I think is very important for everyday relationships, whether it be with your family, your peers, your co-workers, or even just your friends.
Crossroads Chronicles is a project that's been a couple of years in the making, and because AMES' mandate is to build the capacity of the next generation of equity-deserving, equity-denied creative change makers to use story for personal and social transformation, is people from different equity-denied groups telling stories about what they'd like to see. What are the things you wish people knew in schools? What are some of the building blocks? And sort of that slowly built the writing, and then having young people learning how to do code, write code to make a game. And now the next stage that we're at right now is much like the early days of AMES, where it's like put the tools of cultural production back into the hands of the people. This is putting the tools of equity education in the hands, out of the mouths of people who have had lived experience of inequity. And then making sure that young, racialized and marginalized folks are at the front of the class leading these conversations where you're talking about Indigenous specific racism and what are some of the legacies, what are the ways in which this shows up in everyday interactions, even if you don't intend to be, what are the ways that Black specific racism is showing up? What are the ways classism is showing up? Phobia, queer phobia, transphobia. And they're just little scenarios. It's like, they're not like high art, but it's like very relatable scenarios, and trying to bring in the vocabulary to help people, because I think there's a deep knowing that I think everyone has, it's buried. And I think giving language to it. And the game has like 70 pop-up definitions through the game, where you're doing everything from talking about active listening and what that actually means, and accountability and what that actually means, and repair work and tone policing, which, like, it's just one word. Well, that's a new word for people, and it helps legitimize something they've experienced. When you're talking about something and people are like, do you need to be so angry? It's this subtle way in which people who have power maintain power, and people who do not are marginalized, treated as hysterical, whether that be because of gender or because of race. And these are the dynamics. Suddenly people see themselves in it. And they're like, oh my God, that's happened to me. I've done that to people. I've done that to people when I didn't really want to hear what they had to say. I diminished what they were telling me by saying, I agree with what they're saying, but I just don't love the way they said it. It's just when you see these patterns again and again and again and again and again, it's like, well, there's something very deep inside you that wants to maintain power, and you have the power to say what's an overreaction, because you've always held power to classify, getting people inch by inch, little steps to kind of go, oh yeah, this is what privilege really means. Privilege means owning the rules of engagement and realizing, like, what does power sharing actually look like? And what does it look like when you have the courage to actually have courageous conversations with yourself and others, when you have the capacity to enact and embody cultural humility, and then actually incentivizing it with young people. It's like, what keeps people from wanting to practice cultural humility, because our culture is so rooted in this white supremacist, perfectionist, one right way, always be right. So there's so many things that work against it. So we have to be very intentional in saying, I want to cultivate these skills, and learning that actually when you do, and that's that somatic piece, and trying to help seed emotional intelligence, because you can't just have the analysis around race and class and sexuality. You've got to also have the emotional intelligence to stay with the trouble. What does that mean? Because if we don't have the confidence to say, oh, I can't believe that that was in the recesses of my mind, and I brought that into the world, and trying to hit that sweet spot where you have the courage to admit when you've done harm, created harm, perpetuated an ideology you don't necessarily believe in, but also don't get mired in guilt in it. And that also requires folks who have more analysis, perhaps, to not reactively cancel people who get it wrong. So it's like, how do we hold each other capable and accountable? How do we have these conversations where you're not going to be dismissed as angry over overreacting when you say that something hurts you, but you also don't need to punish, dismiss, and write off people when they get it wrong. So it's like, how do we do that? And that seems like these are the skills that we need. So Crossroads is really attempting to heighten people's vocabulary, understand these concepts in story-based context, heighten all the soft skills for hard conversations, which is emotional intelligence and cutting ourselves slack, cutting other people slack, but not being afraid to speak up. My vision, my hope is that young people are gaining the skills to be at the front of the classroom. Young people are seeing young people doing it, holding the next generation capable, even if just a little bit of the compacted psychic soil, if a little bit of space is created to unsettle dominant cultural thinking, to get people to question themselves, each other, the systems that are in play. If there's some empathy development and emotional and somatic intelligence enhancement in the process, like it's something, the whole system isn't going to crumble overnight, but at least this is a way for people to build resilience for personal and social transformation.
Yeah, amazing. It's a beautiful project. I was so excited to test it and go through it and meet some of the amazing young folk who are facilitating in the classrooms, making it really interactive. It's so well done. And I love what you said of soft skills for hard conversations. It's like, how are we building our capacity, our resilience, our language, so that we can engage with each other in really meaningful ways where we're addressing things that are challenging and are nuanced and are really embedded, and getting to rewrite that and getting to hold more of the emotions that live there, more of the grief that lives there, really like receive each other's experiences so that we can actually cultivate changes in the way that we relate to ourselves, to each other, and the way that we structure our networks of community. And I think those are really important skills for all of us to learn, myself included. There was so many terms that I learned going through the game that I'm really excited to keep learning from and keep engaging with. These are things that I wish I was learning in high school, I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about Salish Harvest and where this podcast might go, of bridging into the context of our communities across the Salish Sea bioregion and speaking to this intersection of cultural revitalization and land protection, the beauty of these lands, and the desire to really amplify Indigenous and BIPOC voices and the peoples and the stewards of these territories. And so to do this work with you is a huge, huge gift and something that brings me a lot of joy. And I'm really excited for where it's going. So thank you so much for your time and your inspiration and your support and your wisdom. I'd love to leave our conversation with a question to you. For those individuals who may be listening and are interested in creating positive change through media and storytelling on these themes, what advice would you give?
The energy in your creativity, in your dreamscapes, I think holds the seeds for a better future. Knowing that digging, diving, experimenting work, even though sometimes it feels like you're running in circles, that being attentive to what's needed in the world and what brings you joy in joyous rebellion, that tending to the joyous rebellion and the creative expression inside of you. I think that creating pockets where that can be shared helps to build, it's hard to name, but it's that invisible connective tissue that needs to be tended to, and that somehow, and I can't necessarily put my finger on how, but I think in that is the promise of a different future. And so my advice would be trust yourself, keep being attentive, try to find cohorts. Collaboration is hard sometimes. It's really important to kind of trust your own voice, but then potential for change is exponential when in collaboration, because again, it's that tension between that constantly needs to be healed. And I think that when we can integrate as opposed to bifurcate, it's great. Obviously, pick your collaborators carefully and try to find organizations like AMES or other organizations that will amplify your work, because it's good medicine. And I think, we need more of that medicine.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
She gives it all, you understand. Food, water, medicine. She holds us all, you understand. Family of earth, feet of our skin.
Thank you for listening to today's conversation on the Salish Harvest Wild Ideas podcast. My name is Sophia, and I am honored to be your host, and I am very grateful to all the guests who come on here to share their stories and their wisdom with us. This project is based on the traditional unceded and asserted territories of the Coast Salish people. We honor the Deblekha Guin, the Hul'quim'in'um, and the Sanic nations, and we pay our respects to the elders and stewards of these lands, both past and present. We hope you will join us for another conversation soon.
Food, water, medicine. She holds us all, you understand. Family of earth, feet of our skin.